Okay, so we're going to be messing with Arnold Lighting, and all of the Arnold Lights can be found under the Arnold tab, under Lights. So these are the 6 lights that Arnold lets us work with. Maya has more lights built in their light menu. There's a few different kinds that work in different ways, but Arnold Lights are the ones to use because it'll give you the most control when using Arnold. You can use these Maya lights, but they might not work correctly when rendering with Arnold. So we're going to be using the Arnold lights, and you can detach this panel just by clicking up here. So the most basic Arnold light is an area light. It starts off by default, it's a square. We can change this to a circle shape if we change our light shape to disk in the attribute editor. I like changing it to disk because I feel like this creates a better shape for the light, more realistic to how film lights work. But if you're doing something like a window, an area light would be better. Or if it's like a square shaped light or what have you. There's also a cylinder option, but not really used as much, but it's there if you want to use it. So I'll go ahead and create a plane just to show what this light is doing, and I can hit 7 on the keyboard to enable lights. We're not seeing anything because the light is not exposed high enough, so let's bring our exposure all the way up, and now we can see that's starting to play on the ground plane, especially when we bring it closer. The amount of fall off from this is determined by this spread value here, but the thing is, if we decrease it, it's not going to change because this is just our viewport preview. So I'm going to turn this off and open up our Arnold render view. And here's where we'll start to see the change in spread. Since it's perfectly straight, it's not going to show, so I'll angle it. So here's where you'll see the spread making a difference. And that can be really useful for how soft or hard of a light you want. It'll create harsher shadows. So within this light area, if we place an object, it will be given a shadow. And the shadow will be hard or soft depending on the spread of your light. So for our project, we're going to be making an interior environment. So interior lighting is a little bit tricky because we've got a significant amount of light coming in through the window. And to do that, we'll want to use a sky dome light, but we don't want light coming in from all directions, which is what happens when we create the default sky dome light. It's lighting our entire scene equally. So first, we need to create our room, which will just be a cube scaled up, and we're going to flip it inside out to make it appear to just be the inner walls of a room. So obviously this doesn't really do much for us. We want to see through these walls. So what we need to do is flip this cube inside out. And the way to do that is to flip the normals. The normals are the direction that each face is facing. Every face has an up and a down, or an inside and an outside. If you look at the underside of this plane, this is just a single plane. And you can see it's black on the bottom, which represents the outside, or the side that you don't want to see. So we want the outer walls, or the outer faces, to be the black normals. So to flip the normals, we just go to our modeling menu, under mesh display, reverse, and now it's black. And the way to see through the object is in your render stats, in your attribute editor. You can turn off double-sided. So now we're only looking at the up or inside side, and we're not going to be able to see through the black normal side. And if we did that on the ground plane, the same thing would happen. So now we can see inside our room. So when we render this, we're not getting any light inside of our room because our cube is a solid object and it's not allowing the sky dome light to enter it at all. So we need to create the window with modeling. So I'll just select a face, I'll extrude it with Control E, scale it down, and then just delete it. So we have no face there, there's just a hole in the wall. And now we can see some of that environment light starting to come in. You can see it bouncing around kind of up here, not very intense, so we'll turn up the intensity of our sky dome light. And it's really affecting the outside, but we don't care about any of this outside because we're only working inside of this room. So that's what this light portal light is good for. So I'll create the light portal light, and it acts essentially like an area light, but it's connected to the sky dome light, and it only allows the sky dome light to act where it's facing. So it kind of acts like a funnel for the sky dome light. So I'm placing this in the window, so only through this light portal is the sky dome going to come through. So you'll see now, we do have a white background, but this ground plane here is no longer being lit by the sky dome. And if I were to turn on and off this light portal, you'd see now that outside is lit. So this will just save us a lot of computing time, render time, since it's no longer worrying about the outside, it's only looking at through this light portal. So later on, I'll add our HDRI texture to this. Another option you have here is physical sky, and this just attaches an Arnold sun and sky to a sky dome light. If you just want to have sun and sky, you can see it's rendering here a gray ground and a blue sky, and then there's a sun up here somewhere that's very intense. You can adjust the intensity if you just want to go for something very straightforward, but we want some more detail, so we're going to be applying a HDRI to our sky dome. So we've covered area, sky dome, light portal, physical sky. I'll go over these two once we start going into our environment. So next step, I'll load in my HDRI in the color tab, add a file, and it's located in our assets. In project assets, it's in number 3, environment lighting. Here's our HDRI. And that'll take a second to load in, especially for rendering. Cool, so now we're getting some color coming through this window. I'm going to turn off this area light. And I'm having a hard time selecting it because I keep selecting the room box. So I'm just going to add that to a display layer, set it to reference mode so I can no longer select this square. I'm going to turn off this area light just by hiding it, by hitting H. And so we're still getting light coming through the window from the light portal. And I'm frozen, just for some reason. There we go. So I'm seeing 2 lights come in here, so let me just update this. We have 2 sky dome lights happening, so I'm going to delete this second one. Okay. I'm also going to rotate my my HDRI just a bit so it's more parallel to our scene. And I'm going to bring in our kitchen model, which we've got kind of pre-made for us. We don't have to texture it or anything, it's just a lighting assignment. So I'm going to drag in that object, and it's kind of big, so I'm going to scale it down. And actually, so two objects come in. I've separated the kitchen into the kitchen and then the hanging lights. And these lights are what we're going to use for our mesh light in just a second. So I'm going to select both of these and scale them both down until it fits in my room. You can also scale your room box up to match your kitchen. But you need to turn it off of the display layer to be able to select it. I'm just going to push this wall back. So this will kind of be our camera angle, just a front view of it. And let's see how it looks right off the bat. Okay, so we're getting a good amount of light coming in through our light portal, but it's not really bouncing around as much as I'd like. I'm going to push this window over a bit so that the light's falling on these chairs as well. And I can just scale my light portal to match that rectangle shape. Cool, so now more light is coming onto those chairs. So the main challenge with this is going to be working with the samples of the lights to reduce the amount of noise. So this render just finished, and it doesn't look great, it looks really noisy. So we need to increase our samples to get this to look better. But it's a tough game because it really significantly increases the render time. So you don't want to be working at maximum resolution because it'll just take forever to render each frame. But I'm just going to bring it up a little bit, and there's a few different ways you can increase the samples. In our last project we talked about increasing the samples in our render settings. Under Arnold Renderer we can bring up this camera AA. And this is kind of like an overall multiplier for all the rest of the samples. But here's where we'll get into specific sampling. So the diffuse sample here is going to be the biggest help for our lighting right now. So I'm just going to bring this up to 8, and I'll save a snapshot of this render so we can compare it back and forth, which is really helpful when experimenting with different sample values. And then I'll hit render again. It'll take a little longer. And don't expect it to be perfect. There's a lot more lights we're going to add, and they kind of all come together in the end to make your perfect image. So even though it's not perfectly denoised right now, it still looks a lot better. I'm still seeing some noise here, but I think this is really good. So in the end, for my final render, I would still increase these samples more, but for now, just for working, I'm going to leave it at 8. There's actually another way you can increase your samples, and this is going to be really helpful, is if you select your HDRI or any light in the scene, you can set the number of samples just for that specific light. So if we go to our attribute editor, samples right here, right now it's only pulling one sample for all the lights, so I'm going to bring that up as well to 5. Save snapshot and render again. Now this is taking quite a while. Oh, it's just starting to speed up. But I'm not seeing a huge quality difference from that. Comparing it with my last render. So I'm going to bring that just down to 2. so it doesn't mess with our render time too much. And I'll start putting more lights in the scene, and then we'll get back to adjusting our samples. So the next light we want to add is this main kitchen light, and there's a separate object for the actual lights that we want to have emitting light. And this is where we'll use the mesh light. So just with the mesh selected, hit mesh light, and it adds a light parented to our geometry. It also turns off the geometry, so we're not looking at it. We're just looking at this red wire frame that represents the light. So if we render this, we won't see much happening because we need to turn up the exposure and also turn on the visibility of the lights. So right now we're not seeing anything. I'm actually going to turn off the sky dome just so we can see specifically what this light is doing. So with my mesh light selected, I'll bring up the exposure, and now we can see that starting to play in the scene. I can also bring up the intensity. And then I can also increase the samples here as well, so I'll bring this up to just to 3. And the final thing we want to do, very important, is actually display these lights. So by default, it turns off the geometry. There's a tick box here to show the original mesh, but we don't want to do that because that's just going to show the original mesh with its texture and then the lights on top of it. We actually want this light to be emitting light and be pure white, not this Lambert material. So I'm going to untick show the original mesh and instead take light visible, and now you'll see it's pure white light that's emitting plenty of light for the kitchen. So I'll turn my HDRI back on, and now we can see both of those together. The last kind of light here is a photometric light. This is pretty interesting because you can import a file that's a specific type of light kind of curvature, and you can get these online. There's a very large free library of IES lights. So you can download these files, and it kind of creates a different shape of light that simulates real lights in real life. And it's a lot easier to use these files than to try to replicate this in Maya with your settings. So if you're trying to simulate a specific light, you can use these. I'm not really trying to do that. I'm fine using area lights. So I'm going to create another area light for the kitchen cabinet lights. This is where I'll rotate and scale and reposition it to get the shape of the light that I'm looking for. I'm going to put it right underneath these rectangles here. Copy that to the other side. And then I'll also add some under this oven here. And I haven't adjusted the settings of any of these, but we'll see how they play by default. They're pretty subtle, so I'm going to just adjust the exposure a bit so we can see these more. Set it each to 3. I'm also going to set the color of these lights to be a bit warmer so that they have more of a color temperature. That's just in the color settings. Give it a little orange tint. I'm going to leave the samples for these lights at 1 because I'm not trying to light the entire scene with it. It's just a little detail in the background. Okay, I'm pretty happy with what's set up here. I could go in and clean up a few areas. But overall, this is what we're trying to achieve. We want to use a Skydome HDRI with a light portal to get the main lighting in our room. We'll add some fill light with our pendant light that's hanging over the table, and then we'll add some details under the cabinets here. So once you've set up all your lights the way you want, we'll go ahead and bring up our samples. So I'll bring my diffuse samples up to 10, and we don't have any specular, but if you had reflective objects, you'd also want to bring up each material attribute. If you had subsurface scattering, you could increase the samples there. We're not doing texturing in this assignment, we're just going to leave the default Lambert, so all we need to do is increase the diffuse and the camera. I'll bring that up to, should really be 8 or so before we start, before the noise is decent. So this frame is going to take a while to render. Let me actually just also turn off my HDRI visibility by turning down the camera attribute value. And last, I'm going to get rid of this sphere. And I'll go ahead and render this frame.